why don't we go ahead and get started? I see 12:04, and I'm not sure how many other people are planning to join. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I said, the topic is understanding substance abuse for supervisors, and my name is Gary Barnes. I have been in the employee assistance program field for over 30 years, and have done a lot of these presentations of various types. It might be worth noting some of you may be supervising Department of Transportation people. This will make you a little bit smarter, but it may or may not qualify. In my view, it probably wouldn't qualify as a reasonable suspicion training that you would need to be able to implement reasonable suspicion testing from a DOT perspective, but primarily because we won't be covering in great detail all of the signs and symptoms of what you would actually see in the workplace. We're going to cover that for sure, but not in the same at the same level of detail. Okay, Brenda, can you advance the slide for us, please? Okay, so today we're going to define what we mean by substance use and dependence, and actually there's a new a way of thinking about this. We now call these substance use disorders, and I'll go into more detail about that. I will help you identify signs of substance abuse in employees, and then we'll talk about strategies for addressing employees who you think might have a problem, and we'll talk about the importance of policy and procedures. In terms of developing and implementing policies, you probably won't be fully vested to do that after a 1-hour webinar, because that could be tricky, but you'll be at least motivated to do it, I hope. Okay, next slide, please. So we're starting with the polling question, and in this, for any of you who've done our webinars or done webinars, you get to answer the question, and we give you a few minutes to answer, and this makes the statistics about substance abuse a little more interesting. So what do you think the percentage of working age illicit drug users is who are employed? So how many, so working age would be, I think it's 18 to 65, I think is what they count as working age. What percentage of people who have illicit drug users, so this isn't even alcohol, are employed? So answer the question, let's see what you come up with. Okay, I think we probably gave enough time for people to answer. So let's see what are the answers, Brenda?
Okay, thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
It does. 55% of participants voted for number 1.
Okay.
34% voted for number 2. 7% voted for number 3, and 3% voted for number 4.
Okay. Well, this is exciting. So let's go to the next slide, and I'll give you the answer. Okay. So the second line there tells you, well, actually, no, sorry, that's about binge or heavy drinkers. But so over 70%. So the answer is the 74% or whatever it is. So it's an amazing statistic. Most people who have substance abuse problems and even illicit drug problems are actually employed. And this is just one of many myths about what a substance abuser looks like. And that's really important for understanding this issue. A an alcoholic or other drug addict can look like anybody, look like all of us, and most of them are actually working. And you see that over 75% of adults identified as binge or heavy drinkers are also employed. And then you see these other stats. Workers' comp claims are related to substance use. Substance users are absent from work at a higher level. They have higher medical costs. They have higher turnover rates. I mean, there's so many statistics about the impact of substance abuse, and these are just about the workplace. I once heard a statistic that for every one person who has an alcohol or drug problem, there's about 4 other people who are directly affected by them. So it just takes a huge toll on not only the person with the problem, but families, workplaces, and our society at large. So the reason we give these statistics is just in case that helps motivate you to want to try to address it. That's why these trainings are important. Okay, next slide, Brenda. So one way of thinking about substance use is on a continuum, and you can kind of put yourself on this continuum. And all of us are on the continuum somewhere. So there probably are some of us out there who have never used alcohol or other drugs, probably a lot more of us that have at least used alcohol, and then, you know, all variations from then on. And the way it tends to progress is the way you see it in this slide. Everybody starts, by the way, I haven't met an addict personally who has started using by saying, I think I will become an addict and destroy my life, so I think I will start, you know, drinking or using methamphetamine. That's not the way it starts. It starts with curiosity. To a large extent, substance use disorders are a disorder of adolescence. For most of us, it starts when we're teenagers, and often the signs of a problem are already developing well before we make it into what we would call official adulthood. So you can see how this sort of moves forward, and the part of this that I like a lot is under the use bullet there. You see how it says use is, you know, and this isn't true for everybody. Some people are in trouble from the moment they start using. This is probably more true for alcohol, maybe marijuana, methamphetamine, cocaine, non-prescription opiates. You know, you're more likely to move down this continuum a lot faster. But in that use category, you see how this is how addicts and alcoholics often get stuck, is that they think of alcohol as helpful. I like it. It makes me calm. It makes me more social. You know, I'm funnier when I'm drunk or when I'm high. What they miss is that as they continue to move down the continuum, they're actually not less anxious. They're not funny anymore. The costs of their use are mounting over time, and yet, you know, they continue to view it somewhere in their brain as a helpmate. So you can see then we move into abuse and then finally addiction. And I'm going to talk in the next couple of slides a little bit more about how we view this in today's world. Next slide, please, Brenda. So in my world, we use something called the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistic Manual. Probably a lot of you have heard of it. It's the diagnostic manual for all mental health, mental and cognitive and substance disorders. So this is two very boring slides that I don't even want you to focus on or try to remember. And you're like, why is he showing us these if he doesn't want us to remember? You'll see why. 2 of the following 11 have to be present: consuming more alcohol than or other substances than originally planned, worrying about stopping, spending a large amount of time using drugs or alcohol or doing whatever is needed to obtain them, using the substance results in failure to fulfill major role obligations, craving, continuing the use of a substance despite health problems. Next slide. I'm going through this very quickly. Continuing the use of the substance despite having a negative effect on relationships, repeated use of substance in a dangerous situation, giving up or reducing activities because of drug use, building up a tolerance, experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So if you remember from the first slide, you only need 2 out of these 11. Now the way the current DSM, we used to divide it into abuse and addiction, abuse and dependence. And now we don't do that anymore. Instead, we think of these 11 symptoms, and you have to have at least 2, and then so then you would be diagnosed with a substance use disorder. It could be an alcohol use disorder or a cannabis use disorder or cocaine use disorder. And then it's characterized as either mild, moderate, or severe. So if you had barely had 2 of these symptoms, it might be mild. And if you had all 11, you might be severe, or you might only have one of these or a couple of these symptoms, but it's severe for other reasons. So this is important because it confirms the continuum model that I showed you a few slides ago. We don't really think that people exist in abuse and dependence categories. It's more of a continuum. And so you can have episodes of what you might call substance abuse, meaning a binge drinking episode or something like that, where you do something impulsive, or you cause problems, or you get a DUI or something like that. We would put you on this continuum of a substance use disorder, rather than try to divide you into somebody that's never going to develop an addiction. So that's the key, is if you start on that continuum, you have the potential to head toward an addiction. Okay, next slide, please. So here's another polling question. This is just to make this fun for you. See how much you remember. So the question here is a little vague. And what I mean by this is, which of these was one of the criteria for a substance use disorder? And you could check as many of them as you want. So check as many of these as you think were one of the criteria for a substance use disorder. And I apologize if it's still unclear. In other words, I'm not saying that how many of these are needed for a substance use disorder. You already know that you need 2 of 11 criteria. But which of these 5 that I give you here are in that 11 symptoms? Okay, let's close. I don't think it's going to take people. This isn't life or death here. Okay, what do you got, Brenda?
Okay, I have 47% voting for 1, at least 3 drinks a day. 90%
Okay.
voted for 2, drinking has interfered with work in some way. 83% voted for 3, recurrent cannabis use when it's physically hazardous. And 100% voted for 4, alcohol use resulting in failure to fulfill obligations. And 43% voted for 5, drinking every day.
Okay, great. Well, 100% of you were right that the only one of these 5 that would be part of be one of the criteria would be number 4. Alcohol use resulting in a failure to fulfill obligations. So it is possible to drink 3 drinks a day, 5 days a week, and not have a substance use disorder. It is possible for drinking to interfere with work and not have a substance use disorder. It's possible to have recurrent cannabis use when it's physically dangerous, and it's possible to drink every day. So the reason I showed this, I ask you this question, is that it's not, it's you probably need a professional to help you identify whether there's a problem or not. I would never try to talk somebody out of if they think that they have a problem. It's probably more a matter of trying to understand why they think they have a problem. But we all do all kinds of different things habit-wise. Many people drink a fair amount and don't ever seem to get in trouble or any big trouble with alcohol. And some people drink less often, but every time they drink, they get into a lot of trouble. So it's very, and in the AA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, I think you've heard of that. In their parlance, we call this cunning and baffling. So you could be drinking every day and not have a problem, for sure. There are people out there who drink, a beer or 2 or a glass of wine every day and don't seem to get into much trouble with that. Now, there are health consequences by using, the more that you use, but even health consequences alone may not may not cause you to meet the criteria for a substance use disorder. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I want to get past this because for purposes of what we're talking about today, the real question is, how do these things show up at work? You do not have to be able to diagnose substance abuse to be able to supervise people and be part of the solution. That's what I would call you, all of you listening to me right now. You can be part of the solution to help identify people with substance abuse problems. And of course, I don't know if I mentioned it at the beginning. I said I was in the EAP field. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm a therapist. I want people to get help. And the reason I got into this field is because it's really hard to get people with substance abuse problems to acknowledge their need for help. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So your role as supervisors is to be part of the solution to try to help make that happen. So now let's go into how these things show up at work. Next slide, please, Brenda. Yeah, before we do that, I wanted to talk about sort of use, prevalence and use during the pandemic. And maybe some of you have read about this, but there are multiple additional risk factors right now. And I've had people ask me, wow, Gary, are you seeing, more people with substance abuse problems? And my answer is no. Are there more people with substance, that are getting into trouble out there? My guess is possibly yes. We know that, a lot of people are drinking more. probably doing whatever drug of choice they have, maybe doing that more. They may or may not be getting in trouble with it, and we'll talk about that's in this list. But also they're not seeking help right now. So when I get busy is when people come to us for help. So isolation is a trigger for all kinds of things. There's a whole theory about addiction, that addiction is, comes from social isolation. I think there are too many other factors for that to be, a valid theory that's the only one. But there's no question social isolation leads people deeper into addiction. And then anybody who's in recovery probably relies on recovery support, either AA or NA meetings or Al-Anon or their church groups, and then all their community activities. And we have reduced access to those things. There are self-help meetings being conducted online. Obviously, I hope it's obvious too, there are barriers for some people to get to those, but they are there. And then the loss of structure and routine. Structure and routine are critical for a lot of people in recovery. And even for all of you and for me, structure and routine tend to help us to be more functional and productive. Now, the first bullet under loss of structure is relevant in the workplace. There's less scrutiny. People can get away with more, which in this instance is not necessarily good. Getting away with more means they can hide their addiction more easily. There's a reduction of normal coping mechanisms. There's if a person tends to be impulsive, there's more room and space for that when you don't have the structure and routine and support. And then just boredom can lead people in the wrong direction. We know that stress and anxiety and depression all are higher right now during this pandemic. And we also know that those things are all directly related to addiction. There's an increased physical risk for people who are using. Smoking and vaping increase vulnerability to lung infections. These are just a couple. Opiate users are more vulnerable to disease transmission. So it's a scary time, for people who have, for anyone with a compromised immune system or compromising conditions, underlying health conditions, and that includes addictions. Alcoholism affects every major organ in your body, including your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your liver, your pancreas, and all of these can make you more vulnerable if you were to get the coronavirus. So and then at the bottom I say, and there's much less ability to detect problems at the same time. People aren't driving. I've seen a number of people with addiction problems over the years who they just stop driving, because they get a DUI or maybe 2 DUIs. And so they stop driving and they just, then they could just go deeper and deeper into their addiction without consequences, because they're not getting caught driving drunk. And if they live alone, and in all the cases that I've seen that, the problem showed up at work, usually with people just not showing up. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. So these are things to consider. So now let's talk about the things that you might see at work that might be indicators of substance abuse. So performance-related indicators, inability to focus, substandard quality, decreased productivity. often with certain drugs like cocaine, methamphetamine, you may actually see increased productivity and then decreased productivity. So you may see energy fluctuations and more of an inconsistent or unpredictable kind of performance pattern. Absenteeism, I find that to be highly correlated with substance use disorders. There obviously can be other reasons, and we'll talk about that. Tardiness, unpredictability, low regard for safety, taking extended breaks, missed deadlines. Okay, next slide. And then behavior-related indicators, avoidance of socializing isolation, deflection, blaming, increased use of sick time, absenteeism, defensiveness, mood changes, financial problems. I have this stereotype that I call the despicable alcoholic. We don't have time today, but in my career, we've shown a lot of videos that sort of model what employees might look like who have substance abuse problems. And there's this, I call it a stereotype of the despicable alcoholic, the mean, nasty, usually male, who's, yells at people and causes problems and nobody likes them. And, stereotypes exist for a reason, meaning there are people like that out there, but there are way, way more people with substance use problems that are very kind and they're more avoiding and hiding out and backing away. And I should also say, I'll say it now, I don't know where the best time to say this is. People who are deep in addiction problems are often way better at hiding their addiction than we are at detecting it. They become experts in hiding it. And it's very sad, but it's true. And so, if you wanted to hide an addiction, you're not going to be that despicable kind of person that I was just labeling. Okay, the next slide. Physical indicators. And for those of you who are working remotely right now, you're not going to probably see many of these. Bloodshot eyes, smell of alcohol, or it could be the smell of marijuana on someone. Tremors, shaking, changes in weight, colds, or any illnesses. Constant sniffing when there's no other obvious reason to be doing that could be a sign that somebody's putting something up their nose. And a decline in hygiene and appearance. So these are just some of the physical indicators you might see. Next slide. So we just went through some of the signs and symptoms, and if you did a reasonable suspicion training, and some of you out there probably know what we mean by that, that's where you learn at a deeper level how to notice the signs that somebody may be under the influence at work. And most of those are going to be physical indicators, some behavioral indicators. Obviously, this training is not providing you with that. The symptoms that I just showed you could be anything. They aren't necessarily signs that somebody has a substance abuse problem. But when you start to see a cluster of symptoms and they're chronic, substance abuse is a possibility. And if we can rule it in or rule it out as a problem, that can really help. Because if substance abuse is a problem and it's not addressed, then other efforts you make as a supervisor to address performance issues are not going to be successful. Okay, so these are some of the challenges. It's often perceived as a personal problem, so you don't want to get into somebody's personal business. People, like I said, people with addiction issues are experts at their defensive mechanisms, so you just really don't want to deal with somebody who you know isn't going to thank you for pointing out their problems. For supervisors, there's sort of a universal discomfort with addressing the issue. There's a lack of available services, and then a fear of backlash. Often supervisors and managers, I hope you'll take this in the spirit it's intended, often you accidentally get rewarded for not taking action. Taking action is a risk that somebody's going to file a grievance against you, or say you're picking on them, or claim a disability, or otherwise. So there's a lot of reasons to not act, uh, and so we'll talk more about that. Okay, next slide. The benefits of addressing are, that it could result in actually solving a problem, better productivity, a healthier work environment, team cohesiveness. Remember, coworker conflict is often the result of the failure of leadership to address the performance issues of one of your employees. And then coworkers are left to deal with a poor performing employee on their own. So when a supervisor or manager takes responsibility for dealing with performance issues, they're doing everybody else on the team a favor. There could be a reduction of injuries, decreased healthcare costs, all the things we talked about at the beginning of, what the impact of substance use in society are, and improved morale. And the biggest benefit of addressing, or it's certainly a large benefit, is you could actually help somebody, to get their act together and, literally maybe save a life. If you could be part of helping somebody get help for a substance use problem. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so how can you help? How can you address substance use in the workplace? Here are the ways. First of all, learn your policy. Probably most of you have some kind of substance abuse policy. Some of you may get regular reminders about it, and for some of you, you have to go find it. It may be buried and you have to dust it off and read it. But know what your policy is. Do we have the ability to test? That's a big question. Do we have the ability to test employees under any circumstances? Reasonable suspicion, after an accident, that kind of thing. What help do we have available if somebody has a problem, talks to us about a problem? Now, the second thing on here is you want to identify the behaviors that are problematic without labeling the person. Now, this is good supervision, right? You're just paying attention to your employees' behaviors and trying to manage their performance. That's really your job. And in managing the performance of the people on your team, you will also be identifying potential substance abuse. You may or may not know that it's substance abuse, but you're addressing the issues. And then what I said about reasonable suspicion, so that means, is there, and the word we use here, contemporaneous, meaning in the moment, is there something that I'm observing that suggests that this person may be under the influence? So addiction, substance use disorders can affect a person's performance over the long term, So I could tie one on. I could have a bender over the weekend and then call in sick on Monday. In that case, you're not seeing me drunk. So the reasonable suspicion argument comes up is in, do I appear intoxicated at work? So that's what reasonable suspicion is. And so we use that word contemporaneous. In the moment, we have reason to believe the person might be under the influence. You always want to consult with your human resources people before you take any strong action, or and your own supervisor. Use the resources around you. There's no reason you have to be a lone ranger here. Investigate after consulting, and usually we have time to do that, to investigate the problem before we decide what course of action we want to take. We want you to refer employees to EAP, and we can talk about how to do that today a little bit. Outline expectations, and develop a plan for improvement. Okay, let's go to the next slide. These are really hard things to do. Oh, you see document on there. You want to document along the way what's going on. And by the way, we have other trainings. RBH offers other trainings to help you just with basic, how a supervisor can use the employee assistance program, how to intervene with employees that you think might need help. So I'd encourage you to take that. Okay, extra steps during the pandemic. Explicitly state the reality. So this is this is what you do with all your employees. This is not just for employees with substance use problems. Explicitly state the reality of the situation, that during this time, we're all under more stress and worry and uncertainty, and we all experience variance in motivation, or most of us do. A few of us are really kicking butt right now, but most of us are having, variability in our motivation, and the possible emergence of unhealthy habits. So in doing that, then you let your employees know that resources are available. We have the EAP. They're available for remote consultation, so you don't have to go into their office and worry about somebody getting an infection, getting the virus. And then, there may be other things that your company may be offering. So during the pandemic, I'm encouraging you to make sure you let your staff know, that this is a weird time, and there's help available. And then, as you would do normally, check in individually with people from time to time. It can help move you closer to them. And this can help with employees who may be hiding out and successfully avoiding detection with problems. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to give you some practical skills for addressing employee performance problems. And in doing so, this will include substance use. So we start with this idea that employees, that we have sort of universal job expectations. And if you look at this list, most of them are not actually in their their job performance criteria. You know what I mean? Their job description. These are more universal. Things like dependability and communication and relationships and judgment and problem solving and reaction to stress. So job knowledge and technical skills is just one of them, right? And that's often what's covered in a job description. So we start with this idea that you as a supervisor have the right to expect these things out of your employees. And when employees deviate from these things, when they're not living up to your expectations in these ways, some action may be required. At a minimum, noting it and documenting it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so you're doing the noticing that employees are slipping in some way or another. You're using the universal job expectations to document where their deficiencies are. And then you can sort of analyze the problem. So if their problem is a problem with skill, knowledge, resources, or experience, then you actually can help them solve the problem. Okay? If it's any of those things, then you can help them solve it. Now go to the next slide, please. When performance problems continue and you've addressed any issues with skills, knowledge, resources or tools, and experience, then, drum roll for the next slide, then it may be a personal problem, okay? And if it's a personal problem, and I just listed some of them here, and you see the bottom one is substance abuse. Logically, substance abuse is one of many potential personal problems. And if it's a personal problem, then the next slide, you're not going to resolve it. It's going to be resolved through professional help. And so your challenge as a supervisor is, how do I at least encourage, and if your policy allows it, at some point possibly require somebody to, seek professional help to resolve the problem. Now, where substance abuse is unique here is that is when it's that contemporaneous problem, when somebody comes to work under the influence. That's where it's unique. Otherwise, substance abuse could be one of many problems that an employee has, or it could be the only problem, or they may not have a substance abuse problem. You don't really need to know ultimately, but I can tell you that one of the unique factors of a substance abuse problem is people are less likely to seek help themselves for a substance use problem. If I have a marital problem or depression or anxiety, I'm more likely, I still may, there's still barriers to getting help, right? It's a stigma. We think we can tough it out and do it on our own, that kind of thing. But with substance abuse, it's not that common for people to come in and say, to come in voluntarily and say, I think I have a substance use problem. And it's because of the stigma, and it's because they have these denial patterns. Okay, so anyway, so this is your issue, is if you've got an employee with a substance use problem, which we would categorize as a personal problem, it's going to be very hard for you to make progress on resolving it without getting help. Okay, next slide, please. So the guiding philosophy for managing substance abuse are these things. Always, always, always respect and privacy. People with substance abuse problems, even if they are that stereotype I mentioned, the despicable alcoholic, somebody who's mean and nasty, they still deserve respect and privacy. Safety is a guiding philosophy. People can get hurt, if somebody's under the influence, depending on what your line of business is. So we want to protect everyone. Equity, which is not the same as fairness, is where we rely on your policy. It means we will treat everyone the same. So I could have an unfair substance abuse policy, but as long as everybody gets treated in the same unfair way, we have equity. And there is that argument. The biggest argument I hear is, well, if I smoke marijuana, that stays in my system for, at least 7 days probably, which actually isn't true, but let's say that. People argue that. Whereas if I, get really drunk, I might test negative for alcohol the next day. So that's not fair. Well, it's not fair. But you follow your policy. That's equity. Then health and well-being of all. And then this term constructive confrontation, meaning the reason that we address issues from a substance abuse perspective is we're addressing the performance problems so that we can encourage people to have help, get help for their personal problems. I don't know if I said that right. You have a responsibility to manage employees and manage their performance issues. And the constructive confrontation idea is that in doing so, you are then hopefully providing an avenue for them to get help for their personal problems. Okay, next slide. We're going to run out of time here, I can tell. Okay, so preparing. So now we're saying, let's say you have an employee that you're concerned about, and many of you on this call probably do, and that may be why you're on this, why you're attending this webinar. You always want to prepare. And these are some of my thoughts about preparing. First of all, know your policy. Secondly, get support and consultation. And then prepare. Prepare for what the reactions and responses are going to be from your employee. Prepare for their sidetracking efforts, which is how they try to get you off track from talking about what you want to talk about. And then emotions, I have that on there. This is about managing your own emotions as well as the emotional reactions that you'll get from an employee. A lot of supervisors, when you get to the point where you're addressing a problem with an employee, you're kind of angry. You may be angry, you may be resentful, you may have a lot of negative emotions because you feel like you've been lied to, you've tried to intervene before. So that's a common emotion that you want to check at the door, so that you're not coming across in some kind of a mean-spirited way. Okay, and then locate resources ahead of time. Okay, next slide. I'm going fast now because we're going to run out of time. Part of preparing for addressing an employee is to really be honest with yourself. Why am I talking about it? What am I, why am I addressing this? Because it's hard as a supervisor. Like we said, it can be really challenging. You may get yourself in trouble by addressing it if you're not careful. So what is my motive? Is my motive to punish the employee, to get them in trouble, to get revenge? Because none of those are good motives. The motives are to help. The good motives are to help solve the problem, get them back to performing the way I hope, I know that they can. Making sure that the problem gets addressed and that I'm being responsible. You want to consider what the consequences could be if I don't address it. And then you want to be honest with yourself. And my answer to this question, can I really hide my feelings and reactions? The answer is probably not. You're going to have to work on that and get yourself to a place where your feelings and reactions are under control before you address it. Okay, next slide, please. So I love this slide, and you might imagine that I would love this slide because I'm a therapist, social worker. I'm a bleeding heart. I want to help people. And I believe that supervisors are often in the best position to do something to help generate positive change. Maybe, and I don't mean to be too dramatic here, but you may save someone's life, you may help them keep their family together, and you might prompt someone to deal with a problem that they know on some level they need to deal with. I can't tell you how many employees I've known over my 30 years that come back to the workplace after going to rehab or going into an addiction treatment program, who come back and thank their supervisor for saving their lives. There's so many stories about that. So you're one mirror that's giving them an accurate reflection. And if you show them that they're not doing well and they're not performing well, that's going to help move them forward toward getting help. So in the workplace, we're in a unique position to help people with substance use problems because you have a little bit of power. And people will, there's a statistic about this, and this may or may not shock you. People will leave their families before they leave their jobs if they have a substance abuse problem. So if their family tells them that they have a substance abuse problem and they don't want them in the house anymore, they'll leave and they'll just go deeper into their substance use. But if a supervisor, a manager tells somebody they have a problem, and if they don't get help for it, they're not going to be able to work anymore, people are more likely to actually get help. So you have a tremendous amount of power and influence to help people get help with this problem. Okay, next slide. Mind the gap. So this is just a notice for you. There's a gap between the desired view that we have of how we want to be seen by people. So all of us want to be seen as dependable, trustworthy, honest, hardworking. And if you tell me that you think I have a substance use problem, you're telling me what is the dominant view of somebody with a substance use problem. You're telling me I'm dishonest, I'm not hardworking, I'm despicable, I lie and cheat, and I'm a bad person. And so you got to really be careful when you talk to people about substance use problems, because they hear that, and then what you get is the in-between thing. You get the denial, you get the minimization, you get the rationalization, you get the projection back onto you. So often those defenses come from, a maybe well-intended intervention that's just too strong. So if you come at somebody too strong and tell them you think they have a alcohol or drug problem, what they may hear is that you're telling them they're, a sinful person, right? So you want to be careful about that. Okay, next slide, please. We're almost out of time. Oh, do we have time, Brenda? We got some people leaving. When an employee is, should we do it real quick?
Yeah, we can do it real quick.
Okay.
Here we go.
All right. So here's a quiz for you. So if somebody is visibly under the influence, which one of these interventions makes the most sense? I'm counting to 10 almost. Okay, let's close it.
Okay,
Right.
I just closed the third polling question. So we have 13% voting for 2, discuss possible drug and alcohol use. 58% voted for 4, remove from duty and consult, and 38% voted for 4, have a conversation.
Yes. Okay, so the key here is that if they're visibly under the influence, you want to do number 3. Because in my field, we don't ever want to do anything quickly and impulsively. So you're not expected to know what to do other than get the person off the job. And then that gives you the time to figure out what to do next. I hope that makes sense to everybody. So any of the other 3 might be the right thing to do, but that's not the first thing to do. The first thing to do is take them off and then pause and plan. That's what we call it, pause and plan. Pause and plan, okay, now what am I going to do? You're probably going to consult with somebody, you're probably going to look at your policy, and then you're going to decide what you're going to do with that employee. By the way, removing them from duty means do not let them drive, obviously, if you think they're under the influence. If you can put them in a room somewhere, or if you can, you know, have them do work that isn't, doesn't present safety problems, you know, that kind of thing, that's what you want to do. And you do want to act pretty quickly because there could be a medical problem going on. But anyway, okay, so is that our last slide? Oh, what employers can do. Yeah, just you want to flip through these real quick. So this is about implementing a drug-free workplace. And you can see this. Let's go to the next one because I want to make sure we get to questions. Educate employees about addiction. Next. That may be it. Yeah. Okay, so wanted to remind you the EAP is there for you. You can consult with us. We have counseling available for employees and online resources as well. And then I believe the next slides are resources, right? Yeah. These are books you can read if you're interested. Okay, did we have any questions? I know we're over time. There's a couple people still here, so if you could stay, and if we have questions, I'll try to answer them. Do we have any questions, Brenda?
Hi, it looks like we do have one question. Let's see, what is the definition of illicit?
Oh, illicit would be illegal. Yeah, so we differentiate, and there's no reason to differentiate. Alcohol is legal in most places, and you know, for people over the age of 21, but you know, causes the most havoc in our society, far and beyond even the opiate crisis, which is a huge problem and did cause more, has caused more death, which is the, you know, the scary thing about the opiate crisis. But alcohol, so I would not differentiate between illicit and otherwise, but I'm sure I used that language during this training just because I'm like everybody else and I am not very consistent. But there's the answer. Okay, was that the only question?
Yes, actually, that looks like it was the only question. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. I hope you found one thing that was helpful in this training. And I'm sorry we went over a few minutes. I hope it was worth it. And I hope to see you or you know, be part of a training with you again in the future. Anything else from you, Brenda?
Oh, I just want to remind everyone that I will be sending out a link with the archived recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides. So keep an eye out for those. And thank you everyone so much for attending today's presentation.
Great. Yes, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Bye-bye.